When the renowned neurosurgeon Dr. Ben Carson found himself rushing through an airport terminal on his way to close a multi-million-dollar deal, he never imagined he'd face a life-changing choice: pursue the deal of a lifetime or answer the call of his medical vocation. What happened next changed 3 lives forever. But before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Ben Carson was racing through Atlanta International Airport, his carry-on rolling behind him as he checked his watch again. 10 minutes until check-in closed. The overseas investors wouldn't wait. This was his only shot at the deal. That's when he heard it. Someone help, he's not breathing. The shout cut through the terminal's usual noise. Carson's head snapped toward gate B7, where a crowd was forming. Some people were filming with their phones. Others just walked past, diverting their eyes through the gaps between onlookers. He could see a man sprawled on the floor, his worn clothes covered in dirt. Carson glanced at his watch again. 8 minutes. Don't bother. A woman in business attire sneered as Carson approached. He's been harassing passengers for days. But Carson had already dropped his bag. He pushed through the crowd, his voice cutting through the murmurs. Make way, I'm a doctor. Kneeling beside the motionless figure, Carson pressed his fingers against the man's neck. No pulse. The skin was turning blue. As Carson positioned himself to start CPR, something caught his eye: a marking on the man's wrist that would turn this emergency into something far bigger than anyone could have imagined. Get me an AED, Carson shouted, already starting chest compressions. His hands moved with practiced precision. Each push, calculated. Years of surgical training had taught him exactly how much force to apply. Too little wouldn't circulate the blood, too much would crack ribs. The crowd had grown larger. Now phones recorded the scene as Carson counted under his breath, sweat beating on his forehead. 30 compressions, 2 rescue breaths. Has anyone called 911? Carson's question was met with scattered mumbles. Finally, a young man stepped forward. They're on their way between compressions. Carson scanned the immediate area. Something wasn't right. The man's face was swollen, his neck distended. Then Carson spotted it, half a loaf of bread lying a few feet away. That bread, who does it belong to? Carson's voice was sharp, urgent. The onlookers exchanged confused glances. Nobody claimed it. Precious seconds ticked by. The man's lips were turning a deeper shade of blue. Carson leaned closer, placing his ear near the man's throat. The faint, high-pitched "we confirmed his suspicion. I need a pen now." The urgent in his voice made several people reach into their pockets. A businessman handed over an expensive-looking fountain pen. That's when Carson reached for the Swiss Army knife his friend had just given him, the one he'd been about to pack in his checked luggage. As he prepared to make the emergency incision, a security guard finally pushed through the crowd. "Sir, you need to step away from I'm Dr. Ben Carson. And if I don't do this right now, this man will die." The next 60 seconds would require every bit of surgical skill. Carson possessed one wrong move, and instead of saving a life, he'd ended. Carson's hands moved with the same steadiness that had guided him through countless brain surgeries in one fluid motion. He stripped the pen, leaving only the hollow tube. The security guard stood frozen, radio halfway to his mouth. The incision was small but precise. Carson threaded the makeshift breathing tube into place. Just as the man's chest began to spasm, a harsh wheeze turned into a whistling breath. The crowd collectively gasped as color slowly returned to the man's face. "Where's that AED?" Carson called out, maintaining his position. A flight attendant appeared, running with the device. As Carson attached the pads, he noticed something that made him pause. Beneath the dirt and worn clothes, a Marine Corps tattoo. Not just any tattoo, but one specific to an elite unit. The ED's robotic voice broke his concentration. "Shock advised. Clear." The man's body jerked as electricity coursed through him. 1 second, 2, 3. A pulse flickered beneath Carson's fingers, weak. But then suddenly the man's eyes flew open, wild with panic. His lips moved, trying to form words around the breathing tube. "Sir, don't try to speak," Carson said firmly. But the man kept mouthing something, a name: Sarah, hospital. The words were barely audible, but they sent a chill down Carson's spine. Behind him, paramedics were finally pushing through the crowd with their gurney. "Sir, we'll take it from here," one of them said. But Carson held up his hand. The glimpse of another marking near the Marine tattoo had caught his attention, a medical alert inscription. As he read it, the pieces started falling into place. This wasn't just a random medical emergency. The man gripped Carson's arm with surprising strength. "Please," he rasped. "Sarah Orlando, General Accident." Carson looked at his watch. His flight was already boarding the deal of a lifetime, was slipping away, but the desperation in the man's eyes told a story that demanded to be heard, one that would reveal why a decorated Marine was begging for help on an airport floor. As the paramedics loaded the Marine into the ambulance, Carson made a decision. He climbed in beside the gurney, already dialing his assistant canceled the meeting. He said firmly. The paramedic shot him a questioning look. As he hung up, "Sir," the Marine whispered, his voice horror around the breathing tube. "You don't understand, Sarah." "Save your strength," Carson replied, but the man's grip on his sleeve tightened. For a day, he continued each word a struggle, trying to get there. They took everything. The ambulance lurched forward, sirens wailing. As they sped toward the hospital, the story spilled out in fragments. Staff Sergeant James Morrison, decorated combat veteran, 20 years of service. But the battlefield followed him home in the form of PTSD, destroying his marriage, his career, everything. Then 3 days ago, a phone call changed everything. Sarah, his estranged daughter, critically injured in a car accident in Orlando. No insurance, no money, no way to reach her. Been at the airport. Morrison's voice cracked. 4 days, begging, almost had enough for a ticket. Carson's jaw tightened as Morrison described how 2 men had cornered him the previous night, stealing the money he'd managed to collect. The bruises were still visible under his collar. "Found some bread in the trash," Morrison whispered. "Was eating, crying, then couldn't breathe." The paramedic checked Morrison's vitals, shaking his head in disbelief. "BP is dropping," he announced. "Pulse irregular." Carson leaned forward, noticing something else: fresh track marks on Morrison's arm. But these weren't from drugs, they were medical injection sites. And Carson recognized the pattern. The truth hit him like a thunderbolt. "Morrison," Carson asked urgently, "the medical alert tag, it's about your heart condition, isn't it? The one you got from Agent Orange?" Exposure. Morrison's eyes wide in surprise and understanding. But before he could respond, the monitors erupted in a chorus of alarms. The Marine's body went rigid, his eyes rolling back. The emergency room burst into action. As they wheeled Morrison, and Carson's voice cut through the chaos, rattling off vital information about the Agent Orange complications. The attending physician's eyes widened with recognition, both of the condition and of Carson himself. "Dr. Carson, we've got this," she started, but Carson was already pulling on surgical gloves. "His heart's failing," Carson explained, pointing to the ECG patterns. "Look at these readings. It's not just from today's episode. This has been building for months." The team worked frantically, but Morrison's condition kept deteriorating between chest compressions. Carson's mind raced. The airport incident, the stolen money, the desperate attempt to reach Orlando. It all connected to something bigger. "Get me a phone," Carson demanded. Moments later, he was speaking rapidly into a cell phone while helping stabilize Morrison. "This is Dr. Ben Carson. I need to speak to someone at Orlando General about a patient named Sarah Morrison." The answer that came back changed everything. Sarah's condition was critical. She needed specialized neurosurgery within the next 24 hours, but without insurance or family present to consent. Carson made another call, this time to his private pilot, Frank. "Fuel up the jet. We're flying to Orlando as soon as his patient is stable." Morrison's eyes fluttered open just as Carson hung up. "Sarah," he whispered, "listen to me carefully." Carson said, leaning close, "Your daughter needs surgery. I'm going to perform it myself. But first we need to get your heart stable enough to fly." A nurse burst in. "Dr. Carson, those investors are on the line. They say if you're not there in 20 minutes, the deal is dead." Carson looked at Morrison's monitors, then at the desperate mother's face. The choice was clear, but what he didn't know was that this decision would lead to one of the most remarkable moments of his career, and it had nothing to do with medicine. Carson's private jet cut through the clouds toward Orlando, carrying a stable but weak Morrison. The past few hours had been a blur of emergency procedures, hurried arrangements, and one very surprising phone call. The investors hadn't just been angry when Carson's assistant explained the situation. They'd been intrigued. Now, as Carson monitored Morrison's vitals mid-flight, his phone buzzed with an unexpected message. But there was no time to read it. Morrison's heart rate was spiking again, and they were still 20 minutes from landing. "Hang in there," Carson urged, adjusting the 4. "Sarah needs you." The mention of his daughter triggered something in Morrison. His eyes snapped open, more lucid than before. "Why?" he asked. "Telly, why are you doing all this?" Before Carson could answer, turbulence rocked the plane. Morrison's monitors blared. Red lights flashed across the cabin. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Dr. Carson, we've got a situation. They were being diverted bad. Weather had closed Orlando's main runway. The closest alternative airport was 30 minutes away. Time." Sarah didn't have Carson's phone buzzed again. "The investors But as he reached for it, Morrison grabbed his wrist. In that moment, the decorated Marine broke down. "I failed her," he sobbed, "all these years. The PTSD, I couldn't be there. And now you're fighting back," Carson cut in firmly. "That's what matters." The plane lurched again, warning lights blinked. And then through the storm clouds ahead, Carson spotted something that made him grab the plane's intercom. What he said next would not only save 2 lives, but would lead to an unprecedented chain of events that would reach all the way to the Pentagon itself through driving rain. Carson's medical credentials got them emergency clearance to land at a military airbase just minutes from Orlando General. As they rushed down the runway, his phone lit up one final time. The message he'd been ignoring stunned him. The investors hadn't backed out. Instead, they'd been following the story through their local contacts. They wanted to multiply their investment, but with one condition: that would have to wait. Sarah's surgery couldn't. Carson scrubbed in immediately upon arrival, while Morrison was rushed to cardiac care. The next 6 hours tested every skill. Carson possessed twice Sarah's vital signs, crashed twice. Carson's steady hands brought her back. Meanwhile, Morrison's story had spread through the hospital. Marine veterans started showing up, first a handful, then dozens. They filled the waiting room, standing at attention in silent support as Carson made the final suture in Sarah's surgery. A commotion erupted outside. Morrison had somehow made it past his nurses. He stood in the doorway, supported by 2 Marines, tears streaming down his face as he saw his daughter for the first time in 5 years. "She's going to be fine," Carson assured him. But he wasn't finished. "And so are you. Those investors I was meeting, they've offered to fund a new PTSD treatment center. They want you to help run it." Morrison stared in disbelief. "But why?" Because Carson smiled, removing his surgical mask. "They said they only want to work with people who never forget their oath, whether it's a doctor's oath to heal, a Marine's oath to serve, or a father's oath to love." 2 weeks later, Sarah walked out of the hospital on her own. Morrison moved into an apartment nearby, his military benefits restored through the help of his fellow Marines. The treatment center was already under construction. As for Carson, he gained something more valuable than any business deal: a reminder of why he became a doctor in the first place. Before we end today's story, hit that like button if you believe in the power of second chances, and subscribe for more incredible stories that restore your faith in humanity. This is Ludwig reminding you that sometimes the biggest miracles happen when we choose to stop and help, even when the whole world is rushing by. See you in the next video.